So you may recognize good chunks of what's coming up next. This is very similar to the orientation presentation on the nuclear materials program that you all saw, or many of you saw last month. Recall a lot of this is on purpose, right? It's about building that pattern recognition and seeing these things over and over again, building the vocabulary. And it's going to be especially helpful for you after lunch because we're going to dive into HALEU, that's high assay, low enriched uranium, right? And so having some of this background information now is going to make sure that you're better prepared for this afternoon, okay? So Bert's back. He's going to talk to us for a little while about the nuclear materials program. Just give us a general guideline of what that program looks like. Bert?
Thank you, James. I'm Bert Krapps. I'm over with the Nuclear Materials Programs Division. I'm the director there. And what I want to do is give you kind of an overview of the nuclear materials programs. And similar to what John Clark did yesterday for liquid waste. So I'm going to start with the general understanding of, we have a fairly large area of responsibility. We have, up here in K area, we do nuclear material storage and part of the surplus plutonium, and it's a shared facility within NSA. Then over in L area, we have the fuel receipts, and we store what we refer to as basically nuclear fuel from reactors, spent nuclear fuel storage. Then in H area, we have a processing facility where we actually can take the fuel from the reactors and dissolve it and extract plutonium and uranium material that we want for other uses. And then we have, because of the years and from the Cold War standpoint, there's a lot of facilities we have. We refer to them as excess. And the key one for us well, actually there's two right now. One of them is the F&H lab that we talked to you a little bit about from a deactivation standpoint. And and then the F Canyon, which is deactivated and slated sometime in the future for decommissioning. We pull the waste into those facilities and disposition it in a very cost-effective manner. And one of the key activities over there, which we're going to brief you later this year on, I think Greg requested, is a low-level waste disposal. We actually own a facility on site, and we are able to dispose of a lot of our material on site. There are other type material that we can't dispose on site, but just rad-only low-level waste we can. So that's the general overview for the facilities, and I'll go in a little bit deeper on those. But what I wanted to do really, and this was something early on in my career, I got to understand the big picture. And I think it would be helpful if y'all understand kind of where we've been and what's going on out there from a big picture. And from there, you can kind of get some appreciation of the facilities today and how they work within the organization. So some time ago, when we were running the reactors in the full cycle over here, I call this the fuel cycle. And basically, it's the process of how we go from receiving the material on the front end to making it into plutonium, uranium that we use for various missions within the United States, including fabrication of nuclear weapons. So it started with the material. Uranium is actually a natural occurring ore, and to get the process started, we mine it. I don't know if we do much of that in the U.S. now. We used to do a lot during the Cold War days. There's actually some large cleanup facilities. If y'all have heard of the term, the acronym, from mining, and then we would dissolve it, and then in that process we would get rid of the impurities, and then we would get to the material, and from there it would come in. I was actually talking with a gentleman a minute ago that knew a lot about the M area, but we actually had a fuel fabrication facility on site some time ago, referred to the M area. It's up there in A area. It's all been torn down now. We are doing some groundwater remediation there. But this was where we actually fabricated the fuel. So it would come into the Savannah Riverside, and this facility here would make it into fuel that we would then take to the reactors. And when we irradiated it, in the reactors, we would basically increase the concentration of the plutonium and uranium products that we wanted, because in the general ore, most of it's 238, 238, and we wanted the smaller concentrated type material. In order to do that, through research, a long time ago, they figured out that by irradiating it in these reactors, we would increase those particular parts of the uranium and plutonium we wanted. So we did that, and then from there, all of these reactors have fuel pools. The fuel was very hot, physically hot, but it's also still reactive. We would put them in the fuel basins right by the reactors for some period of time before we bring them over to H Canyon process. And then they would come over to basically H and F. We actually had two processing facilities some time ago. F was the one that did uranium, and H was the one that did plutonium. And from there, we basically would go, and then the liquid waste, as Jim's organization and John talked about yesterday, received a lot of the waste material, which then shows it going to the vitrification part of it. We also have another part of the program, but what I wanted you to just right now understand is, so we started a process here at Savannah River a long time ago when we were, as Mary Beth was talking about, when we first started the facility at Savannah River, where we basically fabricated the fuel. We had one facility for that. We had 5 reactors that actually ran, and from there we had two canyon facilities, and then we had 2 tank farms each canyon facility fed to. And from there, the material would leave Savannah River and actually go into more of the final configuration, whatever that was, whether it was bomb make, and we actually supported NNSA at one time for some generation sources for the Saturn program, I believe it was, and we've done some other smaller missions. But that's what we did for a long time ago, and so now we've kind of had to go from this process cycle to where we're going today, using some of these facilities in the post-Cold War, I'll call it, also cleaning up these facilities. And because of the large size of these facilities, we've been doing some consolidation through the process. So one of the things that we've done here, and we talked to you a little bit about it, is now that these reactors have ceased to operate, we've been closing them down. But one of the things we do, because we have these fuel basins, I call them, to receive fuel from other facilities, domestic for instance, that have commercial reactors they do for science, they don't have a large storage capacity. So Savannah River's been receiving that fuel from them, both foreign and domestic. The difference between foreign and domestic really for us is the foreign is kind of the program that the department did a long time ago with providing uranium for research and other things to these nations, and now they're trying to bring the material back. And NNSA runs that program. We just receive it in the basins in the reactor, and then the domestic, there's like 4 or 5 reactors that run within the Department of Energy for research mainly. They don't produce any generation of electricity. And we receive those fuel, very small quantities, but we do receive them in the spent fuel program. And from there, what we're doing now is we're trying to de-inventory the basin. The good news with all of that is we've consolidated over the years. We had fuel in all the reactors you can appreciate. So we consolidated all of those, and then we had another basin referred to as RUBOFF as the acronym, and I'm trying to remember what it is. Receiving Basin Offsite Fuel, I believe, was kind of what it is, because we receive fuel from other entities. We consolidated all over to L, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But what we've done is we want to take all this fuel, and while the liquid waste program is still processing and closing tanks and running their DWPF to support the current inventory, we're going to start sending them material from what we refer to as accelerated basin inventory. We're going to take it from L, put it over in H, dissolve the material, and then send it to the liquid waste tank farm, and they're going to basically take that material and vitrify it into glass. And that's how we're going to basically work off from an environmental cleanup the inventory we currently have today over in L Basin. Any questions on that before I leave that? But that's a lot of stuff there, but I wanted to give you some appreciation that what we have here today is really from a historical perspective at Savannah River, where we actually use these facilities to produce uranium and plutonium. Okay, so let's talk specific about some of these facilities. So, as I mentioned before, the site has 5 reactors. 2 of them we basically have closed from a decommissioning standpoint during the Recovery Act back in the 2012, 11 timeframe. We grouted those facilities and removed a lot of these outside structures you'll see here on those facilities. But for K area, since we don't use it for reactors anymore, we basically started storing plutonium in there. And over the years, we have consolidated, as EM in their process of cleaning up sites, we consolidated material, and Savannah River was the decision point to bring it all to here. And so this is basically most of the containers you see right here, the plutonium, this is how we store it. This is how it comes to Savannah River, and this is how it stays stored at the K area facility. There's a lot of large rooms in the reactor areas, and it's very well suited. This is a seismic qualified facility, so it meets the nuclear standard for us to store this type of material, and that's what we do. And then if you can look at you'd think a lot of stuff is in here, but it's really not. It's just this inner can here, and it's a can within a can within a can, and then you have this material outside from a transportation storage configuration. I don't know exactly what the material is called right now off the top of my head, but it's an inert type configuration here. So this is what we have, and these cans are not full either. I don't know the exact size of these cans. I've shown them before, but they're not very big. Maybe a gallon kind of size, or something like that. Stainless steel, very robust containers. But that's what we have there. And then what we're doing now is we're basically working to basically repackage this material from these containers into a shippable, WIP certifiable true waste container. And I don't have a picture of that today, but it's basically similar to a 55-gallon drum. It's just got some other configuration inside of it. We do that through a glove box operation. The best way I can describe people who are not familiar with the glove box is I would just assume it's like a large aquarium, and you got holes on the side with rubber gloves, and the folks go and stick their hands in there, and we work within the material within that glassed area so they can actually see what they're doing, but they're protected from the material. These glove boxes have their own ventilation. So they're pulling the air through that, so they're not, and the operations outside is a different ventilation system, so there's a lot of confinement space, safety activities associated with making sure this process works. And this is what it looks like in there. You can see the guys here with their PPE on and breathing air suits they wear for that process over there. So what we're doing with the materials, we're unpacking it from these containers in there, and we're putting it into a container that's been approved to go to WIP, and from there we basically have a facility we built a couple years ago referred to as the CCO pad, which stands for Critical Container Overpack, CCO, Critical Container Overpack. I don't know where that terminology came from, but anyway, that's the term we use for that container. And the facility over there within K area, that pad, it's nothing more than basically a concrete pad with basically a canvas type steel and tube building. And in there we have equipment that can do the characterization that WIP requires before they can certify the waste. And it also has a loading bay on one end of it where we actually load the trucks. And we've already, as Mr. Budney mentioned earlier or yesterday, we've already made 3 shipments out of the area for the material and expect to make a lot more this year. So I'll move on to the L area. It's another reactor. All the reactors are very similar, but this is the one we're actively using, the basin. And this is where we do most of our work in L area is actually underwater. And if you can see this picture here, this is the water line here. So the water's very clear. We have a lot of filtering and other operations we do to make sure the water stays clear. And this is probably about 20, 25 feet. These are very deep. Some of these pools go down almost 30, 40 feet in depth. You can see to the bottom, very clear pools. But anyway, this is a cast, a fuel cast in here. Basically, we unload it Within the pool here, there's a unloaded basin pool, and then the inner bundles are very small in diameter, but very long in length, and we store them in these configurations here. Look like kind of like Coke racks, as I call it, but in a little bit larger thing. There's also areas within the room here, they're actually loading the fuel. Like, you can't really tell it from here, but there's a table here and then a little sloped area there with the tube, and then they're putting the actual fuel. This is not the fuel's within these tubes. This whole component here is aluminum, and we actually take the whole component over to H area and dissolve. So all of this gets dissolved, the fuel in the container. We refer to these as fuel bundles, and you can see the racks we store this in. Again, all of these pictures you're seeing, it's hard to believe, but these are all underwater. And so that's really what's going on in L right now. We have facilities over there for unloading the fuel, and we have facilities in there to keep the fuel in there. We do have a little bit of dry storage fuel, some fuel that we don't have in the basin, very, very little of that. But there are some fuel that from a safe standpoint, we don't need to have it in the water, but most of this fuel's in the water, and that helps with the temperature as well as the radiation that comes off that. The water acts as a shielding source on that. All right, then from L, we'll go over to some of our excess facilities real quick. We did, and we do appreciate a lot of the CAP support for getting deactivation for the 235F. We got a picture of it. It basically was a processing facility where we actually had a lot of hot cells. I mentioned the glove box earlier. This is the step up from a glove box. If it's really high radiation type material, we actually use these, and the glass is very, very thick. We actually use these cells. They're basically a lot of steel and concrete, but you have a glass front in there, and then you have these manipulators that go in over the top that they robotically can do things inside there with the operations. And this is what part of the F area 235F looked like. That facility's now been deactivated, and we're now in the process of decommissioning that, and the plan is to basically a room like this, we grout it up. This will just be filled up with concrete when we're done. We mentioned the consolidation, so we do have it's an old looking thing, you can see because it's a excess facility, but we do have a basin that we used to keep fuel in, referred to, as I mentioned earlier, rub-off, that we need to decommission. I'm assuming we would pretty much just grout the basin in place. Well, I mean, put grout in the basin and leave there are sludges and some stuff in the bottom of it's filled up with water, and we maintain a safe water level. It's part of keeping the sludge in the bottom from having any exposure. But that's a facility there that's excess we need to pursue decommissioning. And then, of course, the big one is our F Canyon. It pretty much looks just like H Canyon, a very long, large facility there. And then one we're working on deactivation right now as a lab. We used to use this lab when we were doing a lot of sampling, but since we've consolidated, we've made this facility basically not economical anymore. So we're now in the process of closing it down, because until we close it down, there's some material in there we need to make sure we have a configuration for long-term safety of it, and also support the long-term cleanup approach to these facilities. And then also we're still spending money on utility costs for that facility, and we can't do that until we finalize the deactivation. So there's some cost incentive to pursue to continue to do the deactivation on that facility. From there, we'll talk about H Canyon a little bit real quickly. This is really a very large facility. It basically has what we refer to as two canyons. They're the length of the facility. That's where you got the term canyon. There's a hot and a warm side. Both of them have cranes. And then inside them, you have a lot of piping and vessels where we work the dissolutions. We dissolve the material. And from there, they go into tanks and eventually we do processing adjustments for the various, and sometimes we do separation of the material. But from there, we basically would then store it until we can send it over to the tank farm for disposition. It's about 4 stories tall. It's about the length of a football field. Very hardened facility. Got a lot of concrete in there. There are some facilities on top of it referred to as the H area B line, HB line. where we did some, it's got a lot of glove boxes up there where we can do some glove box work in years past, but that's been excess to it now. From there, I'm just going to talk real briefly about the solid waste facility. It's in the middle of the site. You can see, I believe that is F over there, and over to the right here is the, which would be west, is the H area facility. So we're centrally located, and we've been disposing of waste here since the 1950s, since basically the beginning of the Savannah River site. This is one of the old facilities. We closed it under record working with the state of South Carolina and EPA. So this is now waste that's been capped, and as was mentioned yesterday by EPA, the 5-year review, part of that we do for these caps is we go out and monitor and make sure things such as cap failure, we got waste in there, so at times it can subside. We go in and do repair and whatever type of filling we need to do to get it back up to where it creates a runoff with the water so we don't have any infiltration. This is a large concrete structure referred to as our law vault, low activity waste vault. This is where we put some waste that has a higher, little bit more mobile type radioactive material such as tritium, which is very mobile into the environment. So we use the concrete as part of the structure to encase the waste, as I call it. Here are some covered, similar to the CCO pad. This is concrete pads with tube, steel type canvas covers. In there we store our true waste. We have a lot of spare room in there now, as you can appreciate, since we're working down the Legacy True Waste program. This is the administrative section of the area here. Just some trailers here for the personnel that work out there. The active facility is right here. It kind of looks like a boomerang. This is the active area that we're currently working within. It's about a 200-acre area. So in summarizing from a high level here is, we have very unique, one of the kind structures out there. You can appreciate we need a very high trained workforce, and that's one of the challenges the contractor has right now with bringing in the next generations, I call it. I think y'all have heard about various things they're doing now with the apprenticeship program and trying to hire some of these young operators for us. We are tied in with NNSA. NNSA has actually brought fuel for us. They brought plutonium and other stuff, so we work with them on a lot of the material we have out there. I haven't mentioned it to this point, but we do have a lot of lab support. The National Lab has a lot of experts in nuclear materials. We use them from various things to H-Canyon operations, to fuel receipts, to dealing with some of the special nuclear materials we have, and looking at potential future missions and other things we can do with some of the material we have. And I can't overemphasize this. This is very expensive to operate these facilities. I know you probably can appreciate that, but just the S&M alone is in the millions, hundreds of millions of dollars. We do have some classification challenges we deal with some of the material. So sometimes we can't answer all your questions because of those kind of concerns we have. But at the end of the day, these facilities are safe. We're going to always operate them safe, and we're going to make sure that, they're protected from both the environment, public, as well as our workers out at site.
Thanks, Bert.
Okay.
Jim, let's start with you.
If we could get back to slide 3. Recently, decision was made not to recover uranium coming out of H Canyon.
Correct.
Could you elaborate on that process change and what we gained and how we got there?
So the challenge we had with operating a very old facility is to optimize the costs associated with that. And the other challenge we were having was the spent fuel program. We were basically filling up the basin at the same time. We've done numerous studies, and we've had outside agencies to look at, recovering our uranium, right? I mean, that seems like a logical approach. But every time we got to it, started talking how much it was going to cost, we never could get the decision made and the entity or how we were going to get it funded. So we continue to have that challenge, and I don't want to steal Jeff's thunder later today, but we haven't really had a customer that was willing to pay for the cost it was for this type of old reactor to run and produce the type of recovery uranium until the TVA back in 2011. So we've been looking for people to receive the material. So between that, the fact that we don't have an active end user and the associated cost with running H Canyon, the ABD became really the only cost-effective way, and from an EM standpoint, a way to where we can clean up the legacy we have out here. So by going to non-recovery, the H Canyon operates very, very simply. We just basically dissolve the fuel, store it, and then we send it over to the tank farm. Under recovery, we had a lot more processes. It took a lot of time. It was a slower process, and again, it was filling up the fuel. So basically, it's a combination, Jim, of economics, feasibility, and then we haven't mentioned a lot about this from our perspective, but the reality is Jim and their guys, they're going to work the tank farm out of being able to receive this stuff in the road. If you follow the liquid waste program, they're going to close all the tanks, and then we're not going to have a disposition source. So the ABD, a key point of ABD is it links the two systems up. So between now and when Jim's going to, and the liquid waste program is going to finish their operations, we're going to be able to de-inventory the most of it, if not all, the inventory over in L, and at the same time efficiently operate H Canyon.
So if I understand correctly, what's changed is instead of spending the time and effort to separate out the uranium, we're just incorporating that into the higher level waste and it ends up in vitrification?
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
Right.
Okay.
Okay.
Candace?
Candace Cave Cab. So on slide 4, when we're looking at the 9975, are those temporary containers, correct?
Are they temporary?
Temporary
They're
storage.
referred to as a type B container, which is an NRC container. It allows it to be shipped. It allows it to be stored. Over the long term, yes, we will basically, the plan is we're going to have a lot of these containers at some time. We're going to need to dispose of the empties because, yeah, we're going to eventually take the plutonium out of these containers and send it all to WIP through the disposition strategy we have there. But that's going to be a long time. We do studies on these. These things can stay in these configurations for a very long time.
That was my question. So how long is the expected lifespan of one of those containers with the chemical, with the
I
material
don't know
in it?
exactly, but I know we're looking at somewhere in the 50-year range.
Okay. My other question was about slide 5. So most of the water, well, the water in L area is a shield. So is that considered like an affluent water? Do you discharge it at some time? Do you use it?
So, you know, through evaporation, things will lose. So we're basically adding water to it, but everything that we monitor there is not leaking. We don't have a situation where it's going to the environment, but we do have to add water from time to time just from the evaporation and running it through the ionization process and the filtration process we do.
Thank you.
One other thing I wanted to answer you on, Candace, is so we periodically, if we have very old material in this, we will periodically open these containers up and inspect them. We have an inspection integrity program. So yeah, we're constantly looking at these containers. It's been a long time since we've looked at them. We will go and bring them out, open them up, and make sure the configuration is still intact and everything. So there is a program to support the 50-year lifespan for these containers.
John?
John Thomas, cab. You showed the glove box. Is there ever anybody on the other side of the glove box? And how does material move to them to work?
So it has a port in and out. It's under, I guess you can kind of call it under a vacuum. So the way the work is there's some underneath, this thing sits up on a table is the best way to, you can kind of see it here. So underneath it, there's some ports in there. And so the material's usually introduced from one end because they kind of work it in an assembly line process. So the stuff comes in this little container here. And I didn't have that, and we're actually going to give y'all a brief, I think, in July about that. But this little container, they'll take this container here and unpack it in a room adjacent to the glove box. You can see how tight it is. And then this inner container here is what we refer to as a 3013. We will take this container and bring it into the glove box. They will actually cut it open, and then they will weigh out and measure the plutonium and then start the process of packing it into another similar size container, but a little bit smaller. We refer to it as a ROC from the acronym. It's a robust over container. I can't remember the acronym. We use acronyms so much, I can't remember spelling. But we put it in a similar container like this, and then we put it into, then it comes out of the glove box in that container. It's sleeved into a plastic bag, and then that plastic bag with that inner container, and I'll be more than happy that we can bring you a little bit of these containers since we've got a lot of new members, show them what they look like. It's about like a coffee can like thing. We actually bring it out, it's sleeved actually in a plastic bag to get it out of the glove box. So it prevent, if there's any contamination on that sealed container, as we protect it with the bag. We bring it out of the glove box, and then from there, we'll go put it into another similar container like this from a configuration. It's got an inner pipe that goes to the top and the bottom of the container, and we'll actually put those things with the plastic into those inner containers of the troop drum, and then we bring that out to the pad where it gets characterized and then eventually gets loaded into a truck and shipped to WIP.
What's the purpose of repacking it? Why open it and
So
repack?
the material in here is fairly large in quantity of material gram-wise, and from a security safety, and I'm getting into an area where I'm really thin on the knowledge, but from a security safety standpoint, this configuration, even though some people would say, hey, this looks like, why can't we send it in WIP? It doesn't meet all the safety and whip-whack requirements, so we have to actually repackage it into this other configuration before we can send it to WIP. So it's a combination of concentration level and security that we got to make it a smaller quantity before we can get it on the road.
Okay, thank you. And the other thing I had was on the L area, and they were repacking they were doing the fuel bundles. It seemed very awkward that they're leaning over. I mean, is this safe? And is that the way they have to work?
Yeah. Well,
Do people fall in the water?
Remember the water shield in them, but we do constantly we do have monitors in here to make sure the room is at a reasonable rad level for them to do the work. But yeah, they do get at times they got these, I don't know if you can really tell it, but he's got a tool here. See the aluminum goes way down in here, and yeah, for them to physically see the work, they actually got to lean over the pool. I know what you might be thinking about from a rad perspective. We have barriers, and yeah, you don't lean over barriers, but this is not considered a rad barrier. So, and this is a fairly robust structured railing system they have here just for them to be able to do that work there. But yeah, I'm sorry I didn't mention that, but there's a couple of these long tools. They're just a long rod, and at the end they got a little tool on, and they use these little controls at the top and to go down in there and do the work down there.
Okay, thanks.
Narendra.
Narendra Malik, CAB. What kind of uranium we have? Is 238 or 239?
We have mainly, most of our material is, I think it's 235 from the radiated material.
And
But
what's his half-life period?
A long time, I don't know the actual.
Millions of years. Thank you.
Right, and so the point is, getting back to Jim's conversation with the ABD, we're taking it from a fuel in the basin and putting it into vitrified glass that will go to a repository. The other option for this is to take these containers and put them in the dry storage and send them in this configuration to the repository. The challenge we have, though, is we're filling this basin up, So if we don't de-inventory it, then there is still other missions out there to support, that Savannah River supports. And that's one of the challenges we're gonna have down the road from a department standpoint is when we finish this mission here and the tank farms close and we de-inventory the L basin, there is gonna be the discussions we're gonna need to have at some point on, do we continue, Savannah River continue to receive the fuel? Do we use L basin for that? Do we go to dry storage? There's some things down the road, but right now, in the near term for us, this is what we've are now planning to do. And actually, last week we actually started discharging material from the canyon to the tank farm under this configuration, where in the past we would separate the aluminum and some of the impurities, and we would recover the uranium. Now we're taking all of that together as one lump in the tanks and sending it all over to the tank farm as one material. And so we actually made some transfers to the tank farm last week through the weekend. So we were really happy to see that process work without any issues. So we're now in the process of actually sending material in that configuration to the tank farm.
Charles?
Charles Hilton, cab. Would you go back to slide 4? And I mixed up, but as part of that process where you're taking the containers out and going to the glove box, you're adding an adulterant to it.
That's correct.
What we're doing here is this stuff, weapons grade or potentially weapons grade in those cross-section containers. And when it comes out of the glove box, it's no longer weapons grade, and they take it in the 10,000-foot salt mine, and we're through with the mess, and getting it out of South Carolina. So I hadn't heard the word adulterant used.
No, and I just for the knowledge, the adulterant gets into a little more technical detail, but the key point is on all of this is that this container configuration is how we manage plutonium within the Department of Energy. I mean, this is how we receive it from other sites. If we send some of the material from one site to the other, this is a facility, this is a container they use, and this is how we ship it. But from a perspective of how do we get from here to something that's acceptable for WIP is a combination of security, as you mentioned. The material is still weapons grade. We don't change the actual, it's still the concentration level material, whatever the purity, I guess, of the plutonium, it considered weapon grade. We still have that even in the true waste thing. It's a smaller quantity, and you're right. We add that adulterant to it, which is part of the security and the impact of being able to recover the material down the road. We're trying to, make it where it's very hard to recover if from a security standpoint, if somebody got their hands on it they wasn't supposed to.
Have you gotten the waste in from Japan yet and gotten rid of it?
We have received waste from Japan, and there's plans for future shipments of Japan waste. That's all I can say on that.
We're not getting waste from Japan. It's
Fuel.
nuclear. It's fuel.
We're getting fuel from Japan. Thank you, Amy.
Excuse me for my terminology. I'm bad about that. Those rods, the zirconium rods, did you ever get the electrolytic started up?
So here's where we are with electrolytic dissolving.
We might need to define that if you would.
So I'm gonna go to the canyon. So the canyon right now is set up where there's 3 dissolvers that we operate over there. There's a large dissolver and there's a smaller dissolver. And how that works is we put nitric acid into those facilities, and we basically dissolve the fuel into a kind of a mixture, in a liquid form, and then we process it down in tanks. That works well with a material like aluminum. So most of our fuel that we generated here at Savannah River, and a lot of that we currently make here in the domestic reactors, is aluminum clad fuel. So we can dissolve that in the reactor, in the H canyon very, very easily. And it usually takes about 12 hours for that process of what fuel we put in there to dissolve. And then from there, we basically move the material on down through tanks and processes, piping on down. stainless steel and some of these other clad material, as you alluded to, they don't dissolve well. So in order to increase the dissolving rate, as I call it, we can encourage that through electricity. And so that's referred to as electrolytic dissolver. When we haven't used that dissolver until the 80s, and when we were receiving some fuel from Japan that were stainless and these other metals, we needed that type of dissolver capability. So the Japanese were willing to provide funding to basically put in a new dissolver, electrolytic dissolver. That dissolver is in place now, and we're working the final electrical aspects of it and the control room aspects of it. And so the plan is to have that somewhere completed later this year, and the contractor's going to start doing their readiness assessment, and we would plan to operate and start introducing fuel to that sometime in '24. So it's making a lot of good progress on that. It's going well, and we haven't really had any challenges with that other than just getting the project going.
The reason that's important for us as cab members is there's zirconium rods in Ale Basin, I'm assuming, that were supposed to go to Idaho. Politically, that's not going to happen. As far as I can see it, I don't know what our officials say from DOE, but my personal opinion, that's not going to happen. This gives Bert the capability of processing rods that wouldn't have gotten out of South Carolina, and he can get rid of it now. So that's why I'm so concerned about getting that thing going.
So yeah, there is a lot of referred to as non-aluminum fuel in Ale Basin. That electrolytic dissolver, the first priority and the commitment we made to the Japanese is we would use it to dissolve the fuel that they provided to us. But that's basically a 2-year campaign. It's actually technically, I think, 14 or 15 months. So in '24 and '25, we would dissolve their fuel, process their fuel, and then after that, we would start using it for our fuel. The non-aluminum is going to be a challenge fuel from us, just from a standpoint we have to encourage the dissolving, as I call it, with the electrolytic dissolver. There's also some other things with their fuels in different shapes and sizes. And so the lab, as I alluded to earlier, has been a big part of helping us with developing those changes we're going to need to be and the testing we need to do. But we have confidence there's a good portion of it we can run through the electrolytic dissolver. So there's a side of me I'm anxious to get past the Japanese to see what we can do with this stuff. Some of it we do know today will not go in the electrolytic dissolver, and that's what we're working. What is the other options for that? And from an engineering perspective, this is what's really fun for the engineer organizations out there at site, is we get to go and deal with these kind of challenges. And so we'll figure it out. I got no doubt in me that confidence that we're figuring it out. But the good news is we can't do a lot of this stuff if we don't have decisions to make to do it. And we've just done that. That was another part about ABD, Jim. ABD brings what maybe we weren't going to touch until 50 years from now, brings it into the next 5-10 year window. So guess what that means? We need to be working on it today. And I'm really excited about being part of the program that allows us to work on some of this stuff today that somebody, another generation from now, would be doing it. So a lot of positives with ABD.
Bert, thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, we'll go right into our next presentation. So if you need to stretch in place, mind your neighbor. We'll go up into groundwater remediation activities with Jeff Ross. Forwards, backwards, and a laser. And that's forward. There you go.
Thanks. Everybody, I'm Jeff Ross. I work with the Area Completion Projects Engineering Group and focusing on site remediation, working closely with Brian Hennessy, Karen Adams, and Phil Prater, who work in Jimmy McMillan's group and work very closely with the regulators, EPA and South Carolina DHEC. And so Bert kind of ended with talking about engineering challenges and fun stuff. And so that's kind of on the processing side. This is on the back end or downstream side. And this is fun stuff too, and it's also very challenging dealing with contamination and looking at groundwater remediation at the site. One of the things that Bert also talked about at the very beginning was kind of the historical fuel cycle at SRS. And that kind of is the start of where this story begins on groundwater remediation. So the disposal practices for waste back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s were a little bit different than what they are now. And we've learned a lot over the last 50 to 75 years. And so a lot of the contamination that we're dealing with is legacy contamination associated with some of those disposal practices, which were considered to be acceptable at that time, back in the 50s through the 70s. So kind of just a general overview of the environmental cleanup program at SRS to kind of set the stage for what I'm going to talk about in more detail, which is groundwater remediation, is that our cleanup program started in the late 80s and actually even earlier than that. And some of our focus on in terms of our cleanup program is those facilities that are managed under our RCRA permit. And that's an agreement between DOE and South Carolina DHEC, and our federal facilities agreement, which is a three-party agreement between DOE, US EPA, and DHEC. And so we have about 515 waste sites in our program, of which about 80% now have been completed. And so we've been working off that list now for close to 40 years. And so as you can see, we have waste sites scattered about a large area of the site, but most of those are really focused on our core kind of industrial areas. So those would be A&M area, F&H area, and then the reactor facilities, which are kind of in a ring around here. So in looking at kind of groundwater remediation, the key fundamental starting point is really understanding what our problem is. What is the problem that we need to address as part of our cleanup? And so we develop a conceptual site model that's really based on understanding what our problem is. In other words, what are our contaminants of concern? Are they organic contaminants? Are they radionuclides? Are they metals? Because each of those contaminant groups will have to be addressed differently. What are the concentrations of those present? Are they elevated above regulatory standards? And then if so, we need to take some type of action in order to address those. How are they distributed in the environment? And that is very important in terms of understanding how we're going to clean them up. And so in this conceptual site model is kind of a generic simulation of what a typical site might look like and what contamination might look like, where you have a source at the surface, and then you have a vadose zone, and that's basically the unsaturated soils and sediments that exist below the surface. And then you'll reach a water table where the sediments become saturated, and that's where groundwater essentially starts. And so at Savannah River site, we have typically anywhere between 10 feet and say 130 feet of vadose zone before we reach the water table. And that influences a lot of our transport of contaminants and how we may then deal with contamination that's in the source area or in the vadose zone. And I'm going to be focusing primarily today on what we do for addressing contamination that's present in our saturated zone. And at Savannah River site, we have typically a series of interbedded sands and clays, where we have primarily sands. Those are called aquifers. And the clay units act as aquatards. They tend to prevent groundwater flow vertically. And so ultimately, groundwater generally flows from the high points at the site to the low points at the site. And those are going to be identified typically as streams. And so we have a number of streams that cross-cut the site, and ultimately all those streams discharge into the Savannah River. And so in this kind of schematic cross-section, you can see the groundwater flow is from the source ultimately towards the stream in that direction. And we may have contamination that occurs just in a shallow zone, or we may also have contamination that goes deeper depending on the environmental setting and the direction of groundwater flow. So in terms of our remediation strategy, how do we address contamination in the environment? And so typically, what you want to do first is try to address your source zones and your source areas, because you want to prevent further contamination from getting into groundwater and from ultimately moving downstream and getting to other receptors and toward surface water. And so a lot of our program focus initially has been on looking at addressing those source zone areas, both the waste units themselves at the surface, the vadose where contamination might be, and then ultimately groundwater maybe directly beneath our source unit. Those areas we tend to address more aggressively in terms of our treatment technologies. They tend to be higher cost because they're more aggressive in terms of their treatment approach. But it's very important to try to focus on getting out the contamination that's concentrated in a small area, because once it gets distributed over a larger area, it becomes processes. The dilute portion of the plume, or what we call the plume fringe, is that portion of the groundwater plume that may still be above regulatory, associated obviously with our industrial facilities. And of the 14 areas, 9 of which we still have final kind of the source zone technologies that we have. Again, focusing on trying technologies at 3 different locations across the site. Heating technologies are very efficient in removing organic contamination, in that you basically heat up the ground. It basically takes organic contamination, which have relatively low boil points, transitions that from a liquid into a vapor phase, and then that vapor phase contaminant can be removed using a vapor extraction system. And so A&M area, where we have kind of the largest area of solvent contamination at SRS, was the location where we fracturing is another technology that we use to try to help remove contamination from the subsurface, especially in zones where we have lower permeability or tighter type sediments. So a lot of you may have heard of or be familiar with fracturing that they do for oil recovery. And that's typically done in bedrock type formations. We do something similar, only at much shallower depths, to basically try to open up some tighter clays that we might have contamination in order to either extract the contamination through vapor recovery, or we can inject materials into those zones to try to treat those. This basically shows a mixture of a sand slurry with a guar that essentially turns that sand into kind of a viscous material that can be injected into those fractures and then creates permeable zones, so the contamination can be extracted out of those permeable zones. This is kind of just a little more detail on how that works. And so you can do those injections hydraulically or basically through pressure. Often they're done in horizontal planes in the subsurface, since we may be targeting horizontal planes of lower permeability. Those fractures can extend 15 or 20 feet away from the injection point, and then that can increase, again, flow towards that extraction point if you're trying to remove contamination. Materials that will treat your contamination directly. So we'll move and talk a little bit about primary plume treatment technologies, and there's a number of different technologies that we've used at the site. In large systems, we have hydraulic control. And so one of our systems I'll talk about is an NAM area. We'll talk a little bit more about that. You have barrier walls that can prevent groundwater from flowing. So those are two types of hydraulically controlling your contamination. And then you have various in situ treatment options that you could use. We've used recirculation wells. We've injected oxidation chemicals that basically oxidize the contaminants or destroy them. We've injected nutrients to enhance natural bioremediation. And we've also used a permeable reactive barrier, and that was where we injected iron filings that were actually came from recycled automobile engines. And they basically acted as a media that then, as the groundwater flowed through, those iron filings helped destroy the contaminants that were present in the groundwater. So the M1 air stripper is our remediation unit that we use for treating groundwater that we've recovered with a series of recovery wells in A&M area. This is one of the pump and treat technologies that has been operating for about 40 years at the site. And it basically is a system of wells that extracts groundwater just like a residential well might. And we collect that water and basically pump it over to an air stripper where the volatile organic contaminants are removed from the water. The water is then clean, and then it's returned back to this essentially discharge point where it goes to a creek. So that system has removed about 600,000 pounds of volatile organic contamination from the A&M area over 40 years. And one of the things that we continue to do over time is optimize that system. In other words, we'll turn wells off if they're no longer very effective, and we may add new wells to the system in order to target areas that have higher levels of contamination that we've identified through our characterization process. Base injection is another technology where we have basically injected a base into the subsurface which neutralizes acidic groundwater. And so some of our waste disposal past practices included nitric acid, and so that nitric acid obviously is an acidic material, and that would contribute to helping to move metals in the subsurface through leaching of those metals from subsurface materials. And so in order to try to neutralize that, we would inject a base solution to basically create a barrier that would then help to precipitate those metals and keep them from moving downstream. Another technology that was an injection technology was silver chloride. This was an innovative technology that was developed in conjunction with Savannah River National Laboratories. And we had done 3 injections in 1919 period. And what's interesting about this is that it basically is a very specific technology targeted for one of the contaminants that we have of concern, which is iodine-129. And so this is present near the F area seepage basins as part of our groundwater permit. We're looking at ways to basically reduce the mobility of iodine-129 and ultimately reduce it to its regulatory cleanup standard. And so silver chloride basically works to immobilize the iodine as it essentially replaces the chloride that's present and becomes silver iodide in the subsurface. And so this is a picture kind of microscopically of what that looks like. And so this was the silver chloride solution, basically the way it looks prior to injection. And then once you have injected it into the subsurface, this was removed from sediment core. You can see that you have the development of silver iodide crystals that basically replace the silver chloride. And therefore the iodine is sequestered in place and is no longer present in the groundwater and able to move. We've done oxidant injection at a number of locations across the site. Oxidants are basically chemicals that have the ability to oxidize organic contamination. And so persulfate and permanganate are two of the common oxidants that we have used. The permanganate, just show you here. This is actually a picture of water that we have coming from a monitoring well, which is down gradient of our injection site. And one of the nice things about permanganate is it is actually purple in color. And so we could actually determine, just based on physical observation, that we had permanganate in the subsurface that was moving down gradient from our injection point based on being able to recover this purplish colored water in the monitoring well down gradient from that well. Edible oil injection is another technology that we use to help to biostimulate microorganisms that are naturally present in the subsurface. And so those microorganisms can help to biodegrade organic contamination. And so tetrachloroethylene and trichloroethylene are two of our most common organic constituents that are contaminants at the site. And they can be biologically degraded to non-toxic byproducts, basically chloride and ethane, ethene. And so we just have to kind of give those microbes a push, and that push is giving them something to eat. And so the organics that we inject into the subsurface provide them a substrate that they can basically consume, and as they grow and metabolize that, they also will then destroy or consume the contaminants that are present in the subsurface. This is just a before and after kind of plume map at TNX, which is one of the areas where we implemented this technology. Just as an example, prior to an injection, we had basically a zone in here where we really focused on putting the edible oil into. And then after 2 years, we had a much smaller, lower concentration plume as a result of that injection. So we're still monitoring this as part of the remedy for TNX, and we've continued to see degradation of those VOCs and a decrease of contaminant levels. This is one of our more recent implementations of a permeable reactive barrier. It's completed in 2019. And the way this process works is that basically this in orange is kind of your contaminant plume. It's moving, and then you basically emplace a wall, which we injected through a series of boreholes that were put into the subsurface. The wall was basically constructed so it was about 250 feet, from about 50 feet below ground to about 180 feet below ground. And it then intersected basically the groundwater plume. The wall was made of permeable iron filings, and so that the water was able to flow through that wall, and as it flowed through that wall, it was destroyed by that material or oxidized in place. This is an interesting kind of, again, photo of what that material looked like that we injected in the subsurface. And so the iron filings were mixed with, again, a slurry of guar, which is a non-toxic kind of organic material. I don't know how to describe it, but it's almost like a rubbery consistency. And so as that suspended the iron filings, it could basically be uniformly injected into the subsurface and spread out through this wall. So talking about kind of now the plume fringe and depleted plume portion of our problems. And so really some of the techniques that we tend to use would be phytoremediation, bioremediation, and then monitored natural attenuation as kind of remedial solutions for those parts of the plume. These can also be used in the primary portion of the plume also. They're not just strictly reserved for kind of the plume fringe or depleted portion, but I just wanted to highlight those as part of kind of this, this subset of the of plume remedy technologies. So one of our phytoremediation success stories is really looking at how to manage a tritium plume that we had present associated with a mixed waste management facility. And we had basically a tritium plume that was moving towards one of our stream systems that had concentrations that were about 500 to 600 picocuries per liter, which is roughly 20 to 30 times higher than what our groundwater standard is for tritium. And so we were looking for ways to try to prevent that from impacting the stream, and came up with this method where we basically put in a retention pond, and then from that retention pond we could take that water and we could basically irrigate both through spray irrigation and then using these basically like a jet kind of to spray the water out. And here's basically a drip irrigation system that we've got set up over about, I think it's about 80 acres of pine that we have adjacent to that pond. And so after implementation of that system, the uptake in the trees and in the shallow soils, we were able to significantly decrease our concentrations of tritium. And so we've continued to see this downward trend. This was implemented starting about 20 years ago, and we're now at about 50 or so picocuries per liter, less than 10 times what we were initially. So it's been a very effective way to try to manage tritium. So one of our monitored natural attenuation remedies focused on here is L area, southern groundwater. And this is a technology that basically allows for the plumes to just naturally degrade over time. So in addition to potentially biological degradation processes that can occur naturally, you also have physical processes that can reduce your plume concentrations over time and distance. And tritium is one of those constituents that can be managed easily using this technology because it has a half-life of 12 years. So every 12 years, half of your tritium goes away just through natural decay. And so that helps in that if you look at a time period of, say, 50 years, you'll go through 4 half-lives. 100 years, you'll go through close to 8 half-lives. And so pretty quickly, you can reduce your concentrations of tritium just through the use of time. And so if you have no receptors, if you have no one essentially exposed to the contaminated water, and if your water's not impacting a surface water body, that's an excellent remediation technology to use. So in this particular case, we had what this map shows is kind of the existing plume when we started, is lightly shaded, and then here in the current purple circle is what we currently have left as far as our tritium plume. And so even in the last 15 years since we implemented this remedy, we've had a significant kind of decrease in our overall plume size, and all of our surface water monitoring points that are located down gradient of these plumes are all well below regulatory standards. So just kind of talking about where the program is going with respect to groundwater remediation. Really over the next 5 years, we have kind of ongoing work that we're doing in P area and C area with our groundwater operable units there. We're currently in the midst of doing a characterization and understanding groundwater contamination in D area. And then we have a lot of work going on under our A&M groundwater permit to address that large VOC plume that we have in this area. I want to talk just a little bit about D area since it's kind of an area that we have currently ongoing work. One of the things that we're doing that we're monitoring to look at its effectiveness are a couple of early actions that we took before reaching a final groundwater decision. One really on the source area there, which was D area had an operating coal facility for over 50 years, and this large 10-acre area had coal storage associated with that that was used to power the coal burning facility, power plant. And so over time, with rainwater leaching through that coal, you basically have acidic kind of leachate go into the subsurface. And again, that acidity helps to potentially mobilize metals. And so we were trying to come up with a solution to alleviate that problem. And so we looked at doing a soil mixing with lime to neutralize. And then we basically covered that with just a limestone gravel. And so that'll help to basically raise the pH of the vadose where it's been impacted and then reduce the amount of metals that are leaching to groundwater. The second piece of this kind of work in D area involved a treatability study where we look at taking artesian water that we have, and artesian water is basically groundwater that if you, it flows naturally at the surface. And so it's under pressure from flowing from distances up gradient. And so since we're fairly close to the Savannah River, we have an artesian aquifer available for us to use. That aquifer, which is a deeper aquifer, is clean and it has higher pH. It has a pH of about 6 to 6.5. Our groundwater in D area in the shallow zones ranges from about 3 to 4, which is acidic. And that acidity helps to move metals. So what we're doing is taking the deeper artesian groundwater, letting it flow just through gravity flow, and basically injecting that into the aquifer up gradient of the area where we have the low pH, and using that to help neutralize the pH of the groundwater and reduce the metals transport. So that's kind of a whirlwind tour through a lot of the technologies that we've used for groundwater remediation, source zone, primary plume, distal plume. Some of the takeaways I want to just share with you is we are collaborative in terms of the way we do work at the site. And so a lot of our successes are due to collaboration with Savannah River National Labs, the Ecology Lab at University of Georgia, other DOE facilities, universities, and of course our regulators who we work closely with to select our remedies in order to implement them. And so that's been a real success story for us. Robust source control, basically spending our money on the concentrated portions of the plume and on our sources then prevents impact of groundwater in the future and saves us a lot of time and money ultimately in trying to manage much larger groundwater plumes. And so that's where more aggressive, active type remedies have been implemented in those high concentration source zones. And we found that working obviously with nature and using the natural systems that we have to try to help us remediate contamination is very beneficial. So the program in general, we've got 33 remediation decisions that we've already reached. We still have 9 areas, as I mentioned earlier, that we have to reach final decisions on. We're now focusing more on looking at the primary and distal portions of the plume, so there's a greater emphasis on enhanced natural attenuation type remedies. I think the other point I wanted to try to make was I showed you so many different technologies, and you may be asking, well, why can't you use something that's tried and true over and over again on these problems? And love to entertain some questions if you have some.
All right. Let's start with Candace over here.
Thank you. I have several questions. So my first is, can you talk about the speed of the plumes? Like how fast are these solutions being implemented?
Yeah, so the groundwater moves generally at different speeds depending on where you're at. And so it can move from a few feet a year to hundreds of feet a year typically. And so I'd say that in general, 200, 300 feet a year is what we typically see. And so because the site is so large, we have kind of the benefit of that to work with kind of the speed of our groundwater not flowing really quickly in order to kind of come up with solutions that are appropriate.
All right, so my next, I guess, question or thought, I don't know, it's about kind of the disposal of the microbes that you use, or like the iron filings you were talking about. So what happens with those things when you're done?
Yeah, so a lot of those are basically in situ remedies, and so they would be in the subsurface. And so the microbes that I was referring to, many of those are actually naturally occurring. So they were in the subsurface long before we got here. And so what we've done is we've just tried to enhance their growth in order to help them destroy contaminants that are present. And so things like the iron filings, over time, probably 100 years, those systems will probably start to not be as active with respect to being able to treat some of the contaminants that we have, but by that time, the contaminants should already be destroyed. And so, yeah, those would essentially just be left in place.
All right, I guess this is my last one, and then I'll come back if nobody else asks this question. But so, how does the tritium or the contaminant impact, like the trees you were talking about? One of the remedies you did was utilizing the trees. Like, what happens if like a woodpecker decides it wants to peck on a tritium tree, or you do a control burn on the tritium trees? Like, what happens?
Yeah,
Should I be afraid?
Yeah, so no, and the woodpecker shouldn't be afraid either. And so, yeah, the ecological receptors have, comparative to humans, actually pretty high thresholds for radiological exposure. So the levels that we're talking about are way, way, way below any level of concern for ecological impact. And so it's kind of just almost as a rule of thumb, the human health is the driver for radiological exposure at the site.
I'll come back around.
Jim?
I have two questions. Number one is on your chart that shows the sites that are cleaned up and those that are to be cleaned up. There's one that's called ATTA. Could you tell me what that is?
That is a, let's see, Advanced Tactical Training Area, I think is the name for it. And it was like, so it's an area where they do weapons training. And so there may be slugs, typically like lead slugs from historical use. I don't know if that's still in practice or not, if lead's used. But once that area is no longer used, we'll basically go in and make a determination as to whether or not we need to clean up some soil in order to make that pristine again.
Okay, you may want to add that to your acronym list.
Okay.
The arms and weapons that he's talking about is Centera. It's like where they do their training.
Yeah, thank you.
Second question was, what's your timeline for moving out of the treatment phase to the monitoring phase?
It's a continuum, and so we've actually been monitoring for 40 or 50 years. And so what ends up happening is that you monitor for your remedies that you've basically applied in place. So some of our containment remedies, I didn't really talk too much about that, but if, for example, if you put a cover on a waste unit, you're going to be monitoring that to make sure that whatever's present in that waste unit isn't leaching out and getting to groundwater. If we're doing treatment of groundwater, we'll have ongoing or concurrent monitoring with that treatment to see how it is effective. And then ultimately, once we've reached remedial goals, if we've reached MCLs in groundwater, at some point, if we're convinced that all the contamination has been essentially treated and is below regulatory standards, then we would no longer have to monitor groundwater. So, but we're probably, we're along.
Be considered as closing the site for monitoring purposes, and you move into the monitoring phase. And that's going to be 100 years, 200 years?
For the SRS in general, yes, I'd agree. Now, for some of the individual groundwater units that we have, some of them have already been closed. So we've already reached our treatment goals and we're no longer monitoring those. And so, you know, there'll be units that come off the list over time as we reach our monitoring goals, but there will be some that will probably go on for hundreds of years.
Okay, thank you.
Hubert?
Hubert Von Tool, Cab. Jeff, thank you for an excellent presentation. You mentioned, of course, many times, including this in your last answer, you talked about monitoring, and in your comments before that, you talked about human health. And so what I would like to ask, and there may be somebody else who can help out on this one, but what kind of monitoring or study do we have going on downriver as well as downstream of rates of diseases, including cancers, that might be related to the contaminants we're dealing with?
That's a good question. Yeah, I specifically really can't address any downstream or downriver studies that are being done. I can address the monitoring piece associated with the site. So from a remediation perspective, we're focused on the problems that are internal. But really one of the things that we're benefited by is because the site is so large, we do not have impacts to the Savannah River from our groundwater plumes. And so when you look at all our monitoring stations and all our monitoring station data that are up and down the Savannah River, which is essentially downstream of the site, we don't have any regulatory exceedances for any of the contaminants that we're remediating for within the boundaries of the site.
Mike, I think you have.
Yeah, I'd defer to DHEC if there's anything that they do. We don't do any of those kind of studies you're talking about because we concentrate on making sure the stuff doesn't leave the site and having a good monitoring program. And Bruce, they call it the ACER, you know, something like that.
Annual Site Environmental Report.
Yeah, it defines what.
It's going to come from the public from time to time.
Grace Ann?
Hi, Gracia Martin with South Carolina DHEC. So the group in which I am a member is called the Environmental Surveillance and Oversight Program, or ESOP, which I kind of mentioned yesterday, but I didn't get to go into as much detail. We actually did a presentation at our last CAB, so I wish that we could be able to have some of our new members there. But essentially our program kind of walks parallel paths with some scientists who are employed through SRS out at the site, and we do environmental monitoring that's non-regulatory, both on the site, around the site perimeter, as well as in some background locations and some locations 50 miles outside of the site. So we do groundwater monitoring, not on the site, but around the site perimeter to kind of see if there's any migration, and we do surface water monitoring, drinking water, soil, sediment, edible and terrestrial vegetation, fish, game, and then milk monitoring as well. So for us, we do calculate a kind of average exposed individual dose and maximum exposed individual dose for each year, which we find to be very comparable with what the site employees find as well, and usually it's very low. As well as our programs funding or kind of agreement in principle with DOE and EPA, it doesn't have as much of the human health impact that you were talking about. So for us, the thing that we kind of end up providing to the public is our raw data, which people can have access to on our website, as well as our own annual report. But in terms of looking at kind of the health impact, we don't have that in our jurisdiction as much.
Kim?
Hey, good morning, Jeff. Good to see you. I had a question about your the edible oil injections and the bioremediation. I guess the question is when those microbes are enhanced when you inject the nutrients, do you have to do anything to stop their growth, or do they just naturally go back to normal levels when you stop enhancing them?
Yeah, exactly, because what happens in our aquifer systems, and so they're usually at pretty low levels, so.
All right, Candace.
Okay, I think my question was kind of, Sam might have answered it already, but is there any research available about like how the remediation tools and the things that you use, the groundwater on SRS, but the larger watershed, like what happens if with those iron filings over 50 years or 100 years, that kind of thing? Is there any studies being done on that?
Yeah, so from a larger watershed perspective, if you're talking about outside of SRS, so because of kind of our unique location adjacent to the Savannah River, all the groundwater units to see if the wall itself is changing like the groundwater geochemistry. And so as you might expect, we're seeing higher concentrations of iron. So, ultimately iron's not really a toxic compound, but it's kind of a nuisance compound, right? So if you have high iron concentrations, you can have staining of, your clothes and stuff like that, right? So we are looking at those types of things to see if there's other effects from the technologies that we might be using besides just impacting the contaminants that we're trying to destroy.
Thank you. I guess DuPont's foresight of having a huge buffer zone worked out in our favor.
Charles?
Candace, to address your question, Jeff, correct me if I'm wrong, all your public water systems surround that area as well as throughout the United States are monitoring for the exact same things that they're monitoring for. We are finding the same things. Mainly what he's got is volatile organic compounds. These are universal solvents. We've got them in our drinking water, very, very low levels. Sometimes we can't figure out where they're coming from. We bring in the scientists. We had one that was coming 4 miles away from us, and we located the building where it was coming from with the groundwater scientist. I always called it voodoo science because, how do you trace water underground? It's unbelievable what they can do. But these, Jeff, again, correct me, they're dealing with common industrial chemicals that were used throughout the United States at a much larger scale at SRS because they're a big place. And we're actually pretty good at cleaning this mess up and tracking it. So the tritium is unique to them, but they've kept it on site, the radiological contamination. But most of the groundwater contamination from these things, you're going to find anywhere in the country. And Jeff, I would like to talk to you for a few minutes afterwards.
Okay, sure.
All right, any other questions, comments from around the table?
Yeah, it's a kind of a organic-based material that it's trying to, again, think of how to describe it. It's almost like a gelatinous is probably the best way to describe it. And it just essentially breaks down into water over time. And so it acts in the short term as a viscous material or this gel-like material to suspend the iron so that it can be injected in place. And then it essentially just degrades after a couple of days. And the iron is left behind and the guar is gone. So.
Imagine cornstarch in your gravy.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Avery?
This is Avery Hammett, DOE. Guar gum comes from the cluster bean plant, so it's totally natural.
Mike, did you have something?
Hey, back to Hubert's question about the studies downstream. So just to put it in perspective, we've been doing this ACER report for about 50 years. In 2021, you know, one of the calculations they do is what's the maximum exposure somebody off-site would get. It totaled 0.3 of a milliram. So in perspective, your background radiation that any average individual in the United States receives during a year is about 360 milliram, and 0.3 milliram come from the site. The effects of radiation on personal health is a well-studied phenomenon, you know, been studying that for over 80 years, and 0.3 of a milliram